The quiet disappearance of Paul Newman opening when a legend stops needing the spotlight in the 1960s and 1970s, Hollywood produced many stars, but only a few became institutions, figures so reliable, so admired, and so enduring that their presence felt permanent. Paul Newman was one of those figures. He wasn't just popular, he was trusted. Audiences believed in him, studios depended on him, and critics respected him in a way that crossed generations. And yet, unlike many of his contemporaries, Paul Newman did not burn out, collapse, or vanish in scandal. Instead, he did something far more confusing to Hollywood. He gradually stepped away without drama, without announcement, and without apology. And as you listen to this story, consider a question Hollywood rarely asks honestly. What happens when a star no longer wants to be central to the story? Paul Newman's disappearance did not arrive suddenly. There was no single moment when the lights went out or the phone stopped ringing. His absence unfolded slowly, almost politely, making it easy to miss in real time. But looking back, the pattern becomes clear: a deliberate retreat from fame, power, and visibility by someone who had already won everything Hollywood could offer. Rise the face, everyone trusted. Paul Newman rose to prominence in the late 1950s and became a defining presence throughout the 1960s and 70s, embodying a rare combination of charm, intelligence, moral gravity, and restraint. Where other stars leaned into excess or rebellion, Newman projected steadiness. His performances suggested inner conflict without chaos, strength without cruelty, and confidence without arrogance. Audiences didn't just admire him, they felt safe with him. By the height of his career, Newman was everywhere. He led major box office hits, worked with legendary directors, and moved seamlessly between commercial success and critical acclaim. Unlike many stars, he was never locked into a single persona. He could be heroic without being invincible, vulnerable without appearing weak, and rebellious without seeming reckless. And this balance made him one of the most bankable and respected actors of his era. Yet even at his peak, Newman displayed a quiet discomfort with celebrity culture. He avoided unnecessary publicity, resisted Hollywood excess, and treated fame as a tool rather than a reward. And this raises an important tension at the heart of his story. What happens when someone masters the system, but never truly believes in it? Success power without obsession. As Newman's influence grew, so did his autonomy. He gained the kind of creative control most actors only dreamed of, choosing roles carefully and shaping projects around values rather than trends. But unlike stars who clung to dominance, Newman never appeared interested in maintaining visibility for its own sake. He was not chasing relevance, relevance followed him. Off-screen, Newman cultivated a life that existed largely outside Hollywood's orbit. He prioritized family, personal relationships, and private passions, deliberately grounding himself in a reality that did not depend on applause. While others sought immortality through fame, Newman seemed increasingly focused on longevity, not just of career, but of self. This distinction matters, because it hints at the beginning of his disappearance. Newman was not exhausted by failure or rejection. He was quietly questioning the value of constant exposure. And that leads to a subtle but unsettling question: is disappearing still disappearance if it happens slowly, by choice, and without resistance? The shift choosing less when he could have had more. By the early 1970s, Paul Newman began making decisions that, while unremarkable on the surface, signaled a deeper change. He took fewer roles. He avoided unnecessary publicity. He declined projects that didn't align with his interests, even when they promised commercial success. To Hollywood, this behavior was puzzling. To Newman, it was necessary. What makes this moment important is that Newman's withdrawal did not come from bitterness or disillusionment alone. It came from clarity. He had achieved everything the system promised: wealth, recognition, respect, and yet he seemed increasingly uninterested in expanding that legacy. Instead, he began narrowing his focus, reducing his presence, and quietly stepping back from the center of attention. Hollywood noticed, but didn't intervene. There was no crisis to respond to, no scandal to manage, no decline to exploit. Newman was still admired, still capable, still relevant, and yet something fundamental was changing. The star who once anchored Hollywood narratives was slowly repositioning himself to the edges. And this is where his disappearance truly begins, not with absence, but with intentional distance. Paul Newman did not disappear because he was forgotten, replaced, or defeated. He began to disappear because he chose to give less of himself to a system that always demanded more. Part 1 ends here, at the moment when Hollywood still sees a legend, but the legend is already stepping out of the frame. What happened after Paul Newman stepped out of the frame after the shift, choosing a smaller spotlight when Paul Newman began stepping away from the center of Hollywood? It didn't feel like a disappearance in the traditional sense. There were no farewell interviews, no dramatic announcements, no sudden absence that demanded explanation. Instead, his withdrawal unfolded gently, almost politely, as if he were lowering the volume on a life that had once been impossibly loud. He still appeared on screen, still delivered performances of quiet authority, but the urgency was gone. The hunger that once drove him toward the spotlight had been replaced by something steadier: discernment. What makes this phase of Newman's life so striking is that it came at a moment when he could have had more of everything. More roles, more accolades, more dominance. Hollywood would have gladly continued building around him. Yet Newman seemed increasingly uninterested in occupying the center of the frame. And this invites an uncomfortable question. What does it mean when someone who has everything decides that more is no longer the goal? Rather than clinging to visibility, Newman began structuring his life around what fame could never provide: privacy, balance, and a sense of purpose that extended beyond performance. His decisions weren't reactions to decline, they were affirmations of agency. Hollywood's response, respectful but uneasy. Hollywood did not resist Paul Newman's withdrawal the way it often resisted others. There was no punishment, no whisper campaign, no attempt to force him back into relevance. Instead, the industry responded with something rarer: respect, mixed with quiet unease. Newman had earned enough goodwill, and perhaps inspired enough admiration, that his choice to step back could not be easily reframed as failure. Still, his absence created a subtle disturbance. Hollywood depends on continuity, on stars who want to remain visible, accessible, and dependable. Newman disrupted that rhythm not through rebellion, but through refusal. He didn't challenge the system publicly, he simply stopped centering his life within it. And that kind of withdrawal is difficult to manage, because it offers no narrative conflict to exploit. Over time, Newman became less of a constant presence and more of a reference point and name associated with integrity, longevity, and restraint. He was still admired, but no longer expected. And this shift reveals something essential about how disappearance works at the highest levels of success. Sometimes a system doesn't push you out, it waits for you to leave. A different kind of legacy redefining success as Newman's on-screen presence diminished. Another aspect of his life became more visible: his commitment to causes beyond himself. He invested time, energy, and resources into philanthropy and social impact, quietly redirecting attention away from celebrity and toward contribution. Unlike many stars who use charity to reinforce public image, Newman treated it as an extension of personal values, not a performance. This redirection matters because it reframes his disappearance entirely. Newman did not retreat into obscurity or isolation. He reallocated his presence. He chose to be less visible in one world so he could be more effective in another. And this raises a question that challenges the very foundation of celebrity culture. Is stepping away from fame still disappearance if the life that follows is fuller and more grounded? In redefining what success looked like for himself, Newman quietly challenged the assumption that relevance must be maintained at all costs. His disappearance from Hollywood Center did not diminish his influence, it reshaped it. The final years, staying without being seen in his later years, Paul Newman continued to act selectively, often choosing roles that reflected introspection rather than dominance. His performances felt less like declarations and more like conversations, quieter, heavier, and deeply human. He was no longer proving anything. He was observing, participating on his own terms, and allowing space to exist between appearances. Hollywood adjusted. The industry learned to treat Newman not as a pillar it depended on, but as a figure it respected from a distance. His presence became occasional, almost ceremonial, reminding audiences of a different standard, one where success was measured not by visibility, but by consistency of values. And perhaps that is the most unusual aspect of Newman's disappearance. It did not end in tragedy, bitterness, or regret. It ended in stability. In a system that often demands everything, Newman chose to keep something for himself. The rarest disappearance of all, Paul Newman's disappearance, is easy to overlook because it lacks spectacle. There is no dramatic fall, no scandal, no mystery to solve. And yet, it may be one of the most revealing disappearances in Hollywood history. He stepped away not because he was broken, forgotten, or defeated, but because he recognized the limits of what fame could offer. In doing so, he exposed a quiet truth. Hollywood rarely celebrates that walking away at the right time can be an act of strength, not surrender. Newman did not vanish from relevance, he chose to redefine it. And in a world that equates visibility with value, that choice may be the most radical disappearance of all.